Thank you, Jorge, for reading last Sunday morning's reading. Good to have it in a kind of English-Spanish, though, wasn't it, really? Added certain things to it, but we're in Nehemiah chapter 2. Okay, so how many of you spent the last 7 days trying to guess how much had been raised for the new building during our pledge day? Let me be honest with you, when I first heard the news late last Sunday evening from the boys in the counting house, and by the way, thank you Graham and Julian and John and Trevor, you did a great job. But when I first heard the news on the phone last Sunday night, my response was, are you sure you got the decimal point in the right place? I mean, 2 million? And I have a further admission to make to you. That faith target of 1.5 that we took into last weekend, the sort of figure that was an indication humanly that we were able to move forward together, well, I was ready to include the existing 300,000, which we had to start with, just in case we didn't reach the 1.5 million, to be 1.8 million. I was thinking of moving the goalposts if the Lord hadn't hit the target the first time around. So I woke up on Monday morning, moved by the generosity of God's people and the huge vote of confidence that gives us as a leadership for our vision, but also humbled by my lack of faith. It was as if the Lord had said to me, hey, Baker, get out of the way. I'm in charge. Your vision, like your faith, isn't big enough. I remembered one of my favorite Charlie Brown cartoons. He's at the back of his house shooting arrows into the wooden fence across the yard. And wherever the arrow lands, Charlie Brown walks across and draws the circles of a target so that the arrow appears as if it's landed right in the middle. And his best friend, Lucy, is watching all of this and asks him, Charlie Brown, why are you doing that? To which our hero, Charlie Brown, replies, because this way I never miss. That's me, often. Maybe it's you. We think we need to help God out by moving the target so he never misses. What have we learned this week? That you can never outgive God. Never. But there's another way that Charlie Brown reminds me and maybe of the church. We're frightened of having a target in the first place. We're scared to aim at something in case we don't hit it. So we don't plan. But as they say, if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. Failure becomes the plan because of fear. Now, on Sunday mornings, we're studying the life of a man who wasn't scared to plan. For Nehemiah, this 5th century BC civil servant, for Nehemiah, faith was spelt R-I-S-K, risk. And that's where we left him last week, asking God to bless his crazy plan. Did you hear it again this morning in the reading? At the end of the first chapter, give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. It's a crazy plan because this man was the Persian emperor Artaxerxes, at the time the most powerful man in the world. And Nehemiah worked for him as his cupbearer. In other words, his butler. If you're following the historical TV drama series Downton Abbey, then Nehemiah was Mr. Carson to Artaxerxes, Lord Downton. It was a very significant role in the royal household, made all the more unusual because Nehemiah was not Persian, but the son of a Jewish emigre family, which was exiled from Judah over 100 years before. Nehemiah's plan had been born in a vision. He received news that hundreds of miles away from where he lived, there in southern Iran, the walls of Jerusalem, his homeland, were broken down and its gates burned with fire. The boiler has broken Nehemiah. And that vision broke him personally. As I said last week, vision is often born in brokenness. But for the man or woman of faith, vision is clarified in prayer as God is brought into the situation. And that's what Nehemiah does. He brings God into his situation. And when God is brought into our lives, perspectives begin to change. Possibilities open up. The walls can be rebuilt, the city restored. There is hope. At the heart of every visionary person is a sense that things can be different. The writer George Bernard Shaw once commented about what makes someone a visionary. You see things and say, why? But I dream things that never were, and I say, why not? Nehemiah was one of those people who didn't stop with the question, why? Why are the walls broken down? He dreamed of things that never were, and with God, he asked, why not? He built with imagination, and that's the theme of our message this morning. Building with imagination. He saw what could be. Jerusalem rebuilt and how that might happen. His praying clarified that, and he drew a target on the wall of his mind. The target was the king, or rather the heart of the king. That was his target. And so the vision, which was born in brokenness and clarified in prayer, was executed by that plan. So here we are in chapter 2 and verse 1. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought before him, I took it and gave it to the king. Now stop there. If you look back to the beginning of chapter 1 and verse 1, you'll see that the timeline is different. In the month Kislev, 1:1. 2:1 in the month of Nisan. Not a Japanese car, by the way. Different date, you see, on the Jewish lunar calendar. Kislev, that was the winter period, probably around about December time. That's when the book, Memoirs of Nehemiah, open up. Now, chapter 2, it's springtime, approximately April. Why do I make the point? I want to make the point that Nehemiah carried that burden and that plan for about 4 months. For 4 months, he waited for his moment to go to the king, to target the king's heart. He was waiting for God's moment to execute the plan. So let me begin by just exploring a little bit more prayer and the timing of God. Prayer and the timing of God. For not every vision, not every dream is for here and now. Sometimes we have to wait. There is, as the book of Ecclesiastes says, there is a time and a season for everything. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to cast stones and a time to gather them up, a time to embrace and a time to refrain, a time to break down and a time to build up. Now, those of you who have been around the Lansdowne family for many years, for generations, will know more than me that this vision of a new building on this site has been on the church agenda again and again. It didn't start a few months ago. Some of you have been praying about and waiting on God for a very, very long time. But it looks, my friends, as if the waiting is finally over. Well, barring 3 years for demolition and rebuild and moving out. Last weekend, imaginative vision and the right time came together in an unmistakable God moment. You see, when we reach that point in our lives, when our prayers and the clock on the wall of heaven tell the same time, the plan is unstoppable. Do you realize that? When our prayers and our waiting and the clock on the wall of heaven converge, the plan's unstoppable. Sometimes we can push our vision for change before we are ready for it. We can orchestrate something, but it doesn't happen. We can try to fix a problem, but it remains broken. Nehemiah waited on God for 4 months. And it wasn't easy, for it cost him. He tells us in the opening verse of chapter 2, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. Got that? I had not been sad in his presence before. Of course he hadn't been sad in the king's presence. If you wanted to keep your head on your shoulders, then you kept a smile on your face in front of your boss, especially if he was the emperor. No smile, no head. So for all this time, month after month, Nehemiah had hidden his brokenness about his people and Jerusalem, and he carried on his public duties. But then the day came, the moment, God's moment, when he sensed that now was the time to look sad before the king. He waited for precisely the day when, as he tells us in verse 6, the king was in public with the queen. Now, that was a rare occurrence in this Near Eastern culture, the king and queen together in public in front of Nehemiah. So here's his moment. He risks everything on his tearful, worried, despondent face. And it worked. Verse 2, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I think Nehemiah prayed about this opening, this conversation, and imagined it repeatedly. And as we'll see, he had all his answers worked out beforehand, but prayer had made him wait. Prayer can do that. Prayer forces me to leave the situation with God. Now listen, I don't know what the issues that right now are in your life that you are praying about. What broken walls you want to see God rebuild. I don't know what God's agenda is, but I know this: before you do anything, pray about it. Before you act and hatch a plan, pray. For prayer not only makes me wait, it makes my faith active. You see, after praying, I am more likely, more prone to trust God. Prayer sets faith on fire. It launches me at the situation. It prepares me for it. That's why Nehemiah's prayer was so significant. Give your servant success in the sight of this man. The target in Nehemiah's mind, the king's favor, would open the door to the ultimate reconstruction project. And God alone could open the door of the heart of the king. On the journey to see any great vision realized, success hinges upon small but critical factors. Read accounts of military conflict. A skilled general knows that the key to a battle is a single bridge, maybe, or a solitary farm, or an isolated hill. Capture that, hold that, and victory is yours. For Nehemiah, the critical factor was the heart of the king, and that, he knew, belonged to God. So he prayed. Lansdowne, we have got a long way to go. Probably 3 years from now before we see around us a wonderful new facility rising up, and there are going to be lots of critical issues to be overcome along the journey, and key people involved along the way. And we need to start praying for the equivalent of Artaxerxes, maybe in the Bournemouth Council Planning Department. The small but crucial battles which we want to see won in respect of, I don't know, the legal covenants that might apply. Perhaps we need to pray that when the diggers and bulldozers begin, that they don't discover the remains of artifacts of a Roman villa beneath us. I don't know. You see, small but critical factors in the delivery of vision. And perhaps most of all, we need to pray that, like Nehemiah, we will be willing to be the answer to our own prayers. As, like him, we give ourselves to these 3 years of blood, sweat, and tears. That's what it's going to be like. The vision we have is not actually of a building, wonderful as it will be, paid for by money. That is not our vision. The vision is of a community of people serving and loving and worshiping God together. And perhaps, my friends, the real sacrifices for us are to come. They're in the future. The uncertainty and the change that lies ahead for each of us. And Nehemiah was prepared to use the resources that he had to meet the needs of the situation. You may not think you have much to offer this project. You don't have building skills. Hey, join the club. You don't have lots of money. But over the next few years, we are going to need an army of volunteers who are willing to go the extra mile, to serve and work without the securities of our lovely old building. For 18 months, we're going to be in the tabernacle phase of our church history. Out there somewhere, hiring premises, living out of suitcases and boxes. It's tough. I've done it before, and I tell you, it is hard work. And we are going to need people to sign up to help us in lots of ways, and to start doing that now. That's why next Sunday we're holding our ministry fair to show how you might make a difference to a youth program, to the worship group, to the prayer team, or the care homes ministry, or the website development, and our media, or our administration. You know the saying that nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. Folks, a little time, a little service, it'll make a difference. And then think about the difference that you can make at work as a Christian. You see, this week, that is your mission field, being the cupbearer to the chief executive, or to the head teacher, or to the management board, living and working with integrity, with a smile, and maybe with a sad face. A face that gets your boss asking you a question, which will give you an opportunity to speak about your convictions and your values and your heartaches, just like our man Nehemiah. Suddenly, instead of having to raise the issue with the king raises the issue with Nehemiah. Isn't that a great assurance for people of faith, living in hostile environments when the odds appear stacked against us in work, when the corridors of power seem closed to Christian faith, when the tide of society is flowing away from us? Isn't that a great reassurance? The Lord is sovereign. It is God who directs the heart of the king. Changing the hearts of people is not your business. It is God's. Whether that's your marriage partner, or your boss in work, or the person in the pew across the other side of the church. Tell God about them, but don't try to fix them yourself. God's business is changing hearts, not ours. And Nehemiah in verse 3 does not play the politician. When the king says, "Why are you sad?" he tells it the way it is. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? That's his big picture strategy, of course. But Nehemiah has divided that strategy up into smaller goals. And so to the question the king asks his loyal servant there in verse 6, "What do you want me to do?" And Nehemiah says, "Well, if it pleases the king, your servant, send me to the city in Judah." And then the king asks him, "And when will you get back? And what are you going to be doing there?" Nehemiah, you see from verse 6 on, has already thought the answers through. So with his big picture strategy, he also has his small goals. So in verse 7 he says, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governor of Trans-Euphrates so that they may provide me safe conduct until I arrive. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy." As I said, Nehemiah must have researched and rehearsed this kind of conversation in his mind 1,000 times during those long months of waiting. And now, encouraged by the king, he even asks the king some questions of his own. "Will you give me permission in letters? Will you help me Will you make my safe passage clear? You see, there he is again, his strategic planning, carefully reasoned arguments, meticulous preparation. He knows what resources he's going to need, how long he's likely to be away, those letters of safe conduct and permissions. But in it all, Nehemiah never forgot the secret of his successful plan. It wasn't the king. Yes, the king, as he tells us in verse 8, granted his request, but listen to this. And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my request. Got that? Because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my request. Anything God does in us or through us of lasting significance is the result not of our effort, but of his grace. So, that's the first broad brushstroke this morning, prayer and the timing of God. Finally, casting vision and building a team. Nehemiah describes his eventual arrival in the area in verse 9. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters, and the king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. He arrives then in Jerusalem with a military escort. And some people don't like it. Sanballat and Tobiah, mentioned in verse 10. We'll meet them and their opposition next Sunday morning, so I'll deal with them then. Let's focus on Nehemiah's leadership skills at this point, from verse 11. Nehemiah wouldn't have heard of a man called John Adair. John Adair was a Scots guardsman in the 20th century, educated at Cambridge and Oxford and King's College London. He's currently chair of leadership studies for the UN Staff College in Turin. John Adair is a leadership development guru. He's famous for his action-shaped leadership model and what are known as Adair's circles. We've got them here on a little slide. Adair and many others like him worked up a kind of leadership philosophy that involves three overlapping circles: the task, the team, and the individual. And the most powerful visionary project comes about when those three circles overlap and intersect, when the task and the team and the individual come together. It's interesting, I'm sure, that there's some things we can learn from Nehemiah's leadership principles, and many of them can be found in echoes of leadership teaching and management theory today. There is the individual first. The individual, Nehemiah himself, he does nothing. If you look at the text, he does nothing for 3 days except rest and get a feel of what's going on in the city. Then at night, we read in verse 13, he begins a careful, below-the-radar research of the situation. Quietly, he assimilates the information he needs from the state of the walls at the Valley Gate and the Dung Gate and the Fountain Gate, all these wonderful names that appear in the text. And he says, in summary, I inspected the walls of Jerusalem. Presumably, he's working out the details of the labor and materials to be needed. And there's, classically, our man again. Faith and forward thinking are not contradictions in Nehemiah's life. He's calculating the resources needed. He's anticipating the problems to be solved. He's clarifying his objectives. All the good work is being done for this great enterprise in private initially, as this individual, with a few others, quietly and carefully does his research. It is not the rush and the hurry of activity that a person gains the respect of those around him through. No? It is what we do when we are all alone. It's there, you see, in the privacy of his own heart and mind, that Nehemiah has been winning the battle. Character is what you are when no one is looking. When no one is looking. That's character. And only when Nehemiah knows all the facts does he go public and cast his vision there from verse 17. He walks before he talks. But he does talk. And here comes the next principle. He identifies the task. Look, verse 17, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. The first thing Nehemiah does is tell it the way it is. You see the trouble that we are in. True vision is never embedded in hearts by hiding from the truth. No, realism is a basic element of building with imagination. It's not negative because it appeals here to the sense of urgency and the importance of the task. It's what psychoanalysts call internal motivation. It's the best kind of motivation there is. I mean, there's another, external motivation. External motivation is where the mother says to the child, come on, darling, it's time for your bath. It's Saturday. And the child answers, but I had a bath last Saturday. So the mother says, I'll let you play your computer games for an extra hour if you do. And of course, when they get older, we tell them, if you get good marks in your exams, I'll raise your pocket money. It's not the best motivation, but often it works. No, Nehemiah uses internal motivation. He doesn't offer material rewards here, but he does offer a restoration of their identity, of who they were as God's people. He inspires them, not by dangling a carrot, but by offering them freedom. That's perhaps the first element of a compelling vision. You name the problem. The people living in Jerusalem had grown so accustomed to the fact that the walls were in ruins that they didn't see it as a problem anymore. They'd become used to it, and they'd learned to live with it. And over the years, they'd lost sight of what could be. Their dreams had died. And Nehemiah says, open your eyes. See what I see. See what God sees. That was the problem. The second element in a compelling vision is the solution. Come, let us rebuild the walls. You see, there's the vision, folks. There's the future. Right there in that verbal picture. The invitation from Nehemiah to imagine a future that is different from the present. To dream of things that never were and ask, why not? And it is a team effort. Let us rebuild the walls. We're in this together. No one accomplishes a God-given vision alone. Now, one of those principles of leadership, it's going to take a team. Not just the individual, but a team. Adair's circle. A group whose hearts are being fed by the same vision and the same desire for change. And the third element of a compelling vision I see here is persuasive reason. Notice what Nehemiah says to them. Look, let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. You see, that is engaging the hearts of these people. The explanation of the problem, well, that gets the mind. The solution, that fires the imagination. Let's see what might be. But the reason captures the heart and moves us to believe that what could be, should be. And then, brilliantly, the next thing Nehemiah does is tell them God stories. I also told them, verse 18, about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. This is far more than a story of a man who believes the future can and should be different from the present. No, this is a story about a man whose life has been invaded by God. A man who has spent time in the presence of God, who's witnessed the power of God. Once you make the connection between your vision and God's work in your life, it will transcend your circumstances. You see, when you make that connection, you won't be starting a company, you'll be financing the Great Commission of Jesus. You won't simply be raising children, you'll be influencing a generation. You won't be holding your marriage together merely, you'll be re-establishing God's order for society. You won't be erecting a new facility in Lansdowne for the community. You will be providing a center of excellence for Christian worship and witness in the 21st century. You see, when we connect our vision to God's sovereign plan, we leverage the future, when we realize that what we are up to is what God is up to, that changes the game. When people have a sense that they're on a journey with God, that they're becoming what He wants, doing what He wants, growing in faith and in trust in Him, experiencing the joy and presence of God's Spirit, then the vision becomes reality. Because when people are part of a bigger vision, they don't ask, why are we showing up again in church and it's cold? They don't ask, why are we being asked to give more money and serve more and pray more? No, their minds and their hearts and their imaginations are engaged because what they are doing is part of the God story. There is nothing quite as impressive as stories of faith, of God at work in our lives. So Nehemiah shares his vision, not of a building project, so much as a work that God is doing in and through him. Look, in the end, people don't follow programs. They follow others who inspire them with a sense of God and the adventure of faith. And that, it seems to me, is the fourth and final element of casting a compelling vision, of building a team. You see, the reason is something which must be done now. It's the issue of timing. Why this vision, as Nehemiah shares it, should be pursued right now, at this time. You can imagine, can't you, the crowds in Jerusalem as Nehemiah speaks to them. Hey, Nehemiah, what's the hurry? These walls have been like this. They've been broken down for over 100 years. Chill out, man. Relax. And then Nehemiah says, the hand of my God is with me. And so he tells them about the news he'd heard about the problems they were facing and how he prayed to God that God would open the heart of the king, and how God did that in the presence of the king, and how the king had given him permission to come and start the project. God had not abandoned them. He'd been at work in the emperor's palace all those miles away. It was Nehemiah's story, not so much his presence, which was the thing that convinced these people that the time was right, that God was in this. It wasn't that his vision that moved them to action so much as his story about God acting on their behalf. The walls had been in ruins for years. That was nothing new. But this was the first time for a very long time that they had been told that God was going to do something about it. You see, a divinely ordered vision will bear the signature of God before, during, and after the work is completed. For what God originates, he orchestrates. And that's why the people get on board with the vision of Nehemiah here. So after they hear his personal story of God's involvement, these disjointed, dispirited people respond, let us start rebuilding. So they began the good work. Wouldn't that be something? If this morning we began to say to ourselves, let's rebuild with the gracious hand of our God upon us. Let's have a look at the broken walls of our lives with a view to change. Let's discover what needs repairing, that marriage relationship, those family tensions, the standoff in work with a colleague. And because this is a corporate, not just an individual response, wouldn't it be marvelous if we, the church at Lansdowne, the family as a community, said, hey, let's start rebuilding. Let's examine the state of our hearts, the priorities of our lives, the values and convictions we live by. For the grand purpose of God in my life and yours, in our church and society, is to rebuild the solid foundation of Christ and his word into us by his Spirit, so that God's name will be glorified and God's people restored. The task then, the individual and the team. And as we sing our closing hymn now, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Think of those moments, think of those gifts, think of those skills, think of the task, think of the vision, and ask God by His Spirit to stir you with others to say, come on, let's rebuild for the glory of God. We stand to sing, Take My Life.